The scent of sawdust. That's what my life smells like now. 20 years ago, it was the smell of ink on a 9-figure bank statement. I didn't lose my fortune in a stock market crash or a bad business deal. I lost it chasing a ghost, a legacy on a silver screen. I traded an empire of concrete for a dream of celluloid and paid $50 million for the privilege of watching it all burn. My name is Leland Montgomery, and I can tell you exactly what that fire feels like. You've probably seen a movie poster on the side of a bus or a massive billboard towering over the highway and never given it a second thought. It's just background noise. But have you ever really stopped to consider the sheer weight of ego behind one of those things? The ambition, the vanity, the mountains of cash required to put one actor's face in front of millions of people. I didn't just think about it. I funded it. I poured $50 million of my own hard-earned money into a science fiction epic called The Last Frontier, and I lost every single cent. This isn't a story about a bad investment. It's a confession. This is the story of how I built an empire from dirt and gravel, only to trade it all for a handful of stardust. It all started with a different kind of gospel, one my father preached to me from the time I could walk. He wasn't a religious man, not in the traditional sense. His church was a construction site, his Bible was a blueprint, and his sermon was simple. Leland, he'd say, his hands rough as sandpaper from a lifetime of labor, never trust anything you can't kick with a steel-toed boot. Stocks, bonds, fancy paper, it's all smoke. But land, brick, concrete, that's real. It's got weight. It'll be here long after we're gone. He was a contractor, a good one, but he never had the nerve for the big risks. He was content building for other people, taking his cut, and coming home smelling of sweat and cement. I loved him for it, but I knew deep down I wasn't built that way. I didn't want to build other people's dreams. I wanted to own the ground they were built on. So I embraced his gospel of the tangible, but I wrote my own chapters. While other kids were going to parties, I was working. I saved every dollar. I took the dirtiest jobs, the ones nobody else wanted. I wasn't just hungry, I was ravenous. My 20s are a blur of instant coffee, sleep-deprived nights studying zoning laws, and the constant feeling of being one step behind where I wanted to be. My first big move, if you could even call it that, was a tiny, dilapidated house in a forgotten neighborhood. The roof leaked, the foundation was questionable, and it smelled of decay. Everyone saw a teardown. I saw a 3-bedroom, 2-bath starter home for a young family. I poured every penny I had and every ounce of sweat I could produce into that place. I learned plumbing from library books and laid flooring by watching videos. 6 months later, I sold it for a profit that, to me, felt like a king's ransom. It wasn't the money that hooked me, though, it was the proof that my father's gospel was true, and that my own ambition wasn't just a daydream. I could turn rot into revenue. I could see value where others only saw ruin. That became my superpower. And a few years later, it led me to the deal that changed everything. On the edge of the city was a sprawling wasteland known as the Old Iron District. It was a graveyard of industry, rusting skeletons of forgotten factories, warehouses with broken windows like vacant eyes, and acres of cracked asphalt. For decades, it was the city's shame. But I drove through it one day, and I didn't see the decay. I saw arteries. I saw the old railway lines that connected to the main port. I saw the proximity to the new interstate highway. While everyone else was focused on building shiny glass towers downtown, I saw the future of logistics. This wasn't a graveyard. It was a sleeping giant. The city's entire supply chain could flow through this place. I spent a year putting the plan together, a year of sleepless nights, of poring over maps and freight schedules, of convincing myself I wasn't insane. Then I took the plunge. I leveraged everything I had built up to that point. I borrowed from banks whose loan officers looked at me like I was a madman. I put my entire modest fortune on the line for a piece of contaminated, forgotten dirt. My father thought I had lost my mind. "It's a swamp, Leland. You're buying a swamp," he yelled at me. But I could see it so clearly. That hunger to win, to prove everyone wrong, took me a long way, to a very different world. Before I tell you how I went from dusty construction sites to glamorous movie sets, If you're new here and finding some value in this cautionary tale, maybe consider subscribing to the channel. And I'm curious, tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story of my spectacular failure is traveling. The first few years after buying the Iron District were brutal. It was a war on a dozen fronts: environmental cleanup, rezoning battles with the city council, endless negotiations with shipping companies. My calendar didn't have weekends, it had closing dates and inspection deadlines. I lived and breathed that project. My word became my bond. My reputation was forged in those tough backroom deals. People learned that Leland Montgomery was a hard negotiator, but that a handshake from him was as solid as the foundations he poured. And slowly, painstakingly, the vision started to become reality. The first warehouse went up, then a whole logistics park. Trucks started rolling in and out, 24 hours a day. Money, real money, started to flow. I remember the day my accountant called. He was a quiet, unassuming man named David, who had been with me since the early days. He said, "Well, Leland, congratulations. Your net worth officially crossed the 8-figure mark today. $10 million. I just said, "Okay, David. Send over the quarterly reports when you're done." I hung up the phone and stared out the window of my office, which now overlooked the thriving commercial hub I had built from nothing. There was no celebration, no champagne, just a quiet, humming satisfaction, quickly followed by a familiar, gnawing question: what's next? The first million had been a milestone. The first 10 million was just a number. It wasn't the finish line. It was just another marker in a race I was running against myself. Over the next decade, that race turned into a victory lap. Montgomery Properties became an empire. I acquired commercial real estate across the country. My name was on skyscrapers. I was the king of a world I had built from dust and determination, a world of tangible assets, of predictable returns, of concrete and steel. I had more money than I could ever spend. I had the respect of my peers and the fear of my competitors. I had proven my father's gospel right, on a scale he could never have imagined. But a funny thing happens when you get to the top of the mountain you spent your whole life climbing. You look around at the breathtaking view, and a quiet, terrifying thought whispers in your ear. Is this it? The problem with reaching the summit is that the only direction left to go is down. But for a while the view is intoxicating. By my late 40s, Montgomery Properties was less of a company and more of a self-sustaining financial engine. My days, which had once been a whirlwind of high-stakes negotiations and frantic site visits, had settled into a kind of gilded monotony. I was surrounded by brilliant people I paid handsomely to handle the day-to-day grind. My primary function was to show up in a boardroom, listen to reports that confirmed we were making obscene amounts of money, nod sagely, and then go to a lunch that cost more than my first car. The hunger that had propelled me for 3 decades had been satiated. I was full, prosperous, and profoundly dangerously bored. I had conquered the world of tangible assets, and its predictability was beginning to feel like a cage. My wife, Sarah, saw it before I did. To combat my growing restlessness, she began pushing me into the world of philanthropy. It started with silent donations, then seats on charitable boards, and eventually the obligatory attendance at black-tie galas. I hated them at first. The rooms were filled with people who had inherited their wealth, talking about abstract problems while sipping vintage champagne. My world was about profit margins and square footage. Theirs was about appearances and social maneuvering. I felt like a bull in a china shop, a man of concrete and rebar adrift in a sea of silk and empty pleasantries. But it was at one of these galas, a fundraiser for some arts foundation, that the first crack in my foundation appeared. I was cornered near the bar by a group of people from the film industry. They didn't talk about interest rates or zoning variances. They spoke a different language entirely, a language of narratives, of emotional impact, of legacy. They weren't building structures. They were crafting stories. They spoke of immortality through art. When they found out who I was, their eyes lit up, but not with the usual mixture of fear and respect I saw in the business world. It was a different kind of appraisal. They saw a patron, a Medici, a source. That night, a producer, a slick man with a practiced smile, pitched me on a small independent film. He wasn't asking for an investment in the way I understood it, with projections and risk assessments. He was selling a feeling, the chance to be part of something important. On a whim, driven by boredom and a glass of excellent scotch, I wrote him a check for $100,000. I barely felt it leave my account. 6 months later, I received an invitation to a private screening. I sat in the dark theater, and when the credits rolled, I saw it. Executive producer, Leland Montgomery. Seeing my name on a building was a monument to my financial success. Seeing it on a screen felt personal. It was a different kind of validation. The applause in the room, however modest, felt warmer than any boardroom approval I had ever received. I had helped create something. I hadn't laid a single brick, but I had a credit. It was a drug, and I had just taken my first hit. I financed a few more small projects after that, enjoying my new status as a patron of the arts. It was a fascinating, low-stakes hobby, a way to feel a spark of that old thrill. And then I met Julian Croft. Julian wasn't like the other Hollywood types. He wasn't slick. He was magnetic. He had a mane of wild, graying hair, eyes that burned with an almost terrifying intensity, and he spoke with an evangelical zeal. He was a director, a so-called visionary, known for 2 critically acclaimed but commercially disastrous films. He didn't approach me at a party. He arranged a formal meeting in my office, a space designed to intimidate. He walked in, not with a PowerPoint presentation, but with a single, massive, leather-bound script that he placed on my mahogany desk with the reverence of a priest placing a Bible on an altar. The title, embossed in gold leaf, read, "The Last Frontier." For 2 hours, he didn't pitch me a movie. He painted a universe. He spoke of a story that wasn't just about spaceships and aliens, but about humanity's search for meaning in a dying cosmos. It was a philosophical epic, a visual poem, a story that would, in his words, hold a mirror up to the soul of our species. He paced my office, acting out scenes, his voice dropping to a whisper one moment and rising to a thunderous crescendo the next. He wasn't just selling a project. He was inducting me into his religion. He made my empire of logistics parks and office towers feel so small, so terrestrial. He was offering a chance to build a world, not just a warehouse. He concluded his performance by looking me dead in the eye and saying, "Mr. Montgomery, men like you build the cities where people live. I build the dreams they live for. This film won't just make money, it will make you immortal." It was the most brilliant, seductive nonsense I had ever heard. Every rational part of my brain, the part that had built my fortune brick by brick, was screaming. The numbers didn't make sense. The scale was absurd. The risk was astronomical. But another part of me, the part that was suffocating in the predictability of my own success, was captivated. He wasn't offering an investment. He was offering an escape. A legacy beyond balance sheets. He left the script with me. It was dense, brilliant, and utterly unfilmable by any conventional standard. I knew it, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Before I made a decision, I did the one sensible thing I had been trained to do my entire life. I consulted my expert. David, my accountant and financial advisor for over 20 years, was the polar opposite of Julian. He was a man of spreadsheets and hard data. He saw the world in black and white, profit and loss. I had him read the script and review Julian's preliminary budget, which was already breathtakingly high. David came back to my office a week later and placed the documents on my desk as if they were radioactive. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. He just looked at me with a profound sense of disappointment. "Leland," he began, his voice calm and steady, "I've been with you since you were flipping that first shack in the East End. I've watched you build this entire enterprise on one principle, calculated risk, based on tangible assets. This," he said, tapping the script with a single finger, "is the opposite of that. This is not an investment. This is a vanity black hole. The budget is a fantasy. The projections are pure fiction. You don't understand this business. It's a world of sharks who will smile in your face while they drain your accounts. Please, stick to what you know. Stick to the bricks." Every word he said was true. It was the gospel my father had preached. It was the code I had lived by. I knew with absolute certainty that David was right, but his logic felt grey and lifeless next to the vibrant, cosmic tapestry Julian had woven in my mind. David saw risk. I saw a chance to be remembered for more than just real estate. He saw a financial drain. I saw my name in the history books of cinema. The argument in my head was a war between the man I was and the man I desperately, foolishly wanted to become. I looked at David, the man who had helped me make my fortune, the voice of reason that had guided me for decades, and for the first time, I didn't see a trusted advisor. I saw an obstacle. I saw a man who couldn't comprehend the scale of my new ambition. "I appreciate your concern, David," I said, the words feeling like a betrayal even as I spoke them, "but I think you're missing the bigger picture." The look on his face was one I will never forget. It wasn't anger. It was sorrow. He simply nodded, gathered his papers, and left my office. That evening I sat alone, the heavy script in my lap. I was at a crossroads. One path led back to the safe, predictable, and soul-crushingly boring world I had mastered. The other led into a dazzling, treacherous, unknown territory. Pride is a powerful intoxicant. It quiets the voice of reason and amplifies the whispers of grandeur. I wanted to be more than a landlord to the world. I wanted to be a creator of worlds. I picked up the phone and called Julian Croft. The next day I signed the initial financing agreement. The first check I wrote was for $10 million. I stared at the signature, my own name on the bottom line, and a cold dread mixed with exhilarating excitement washed over me. It was the first nail in my own beautifully gilded coffin. Writing that first check was like pushing a boulder off a cliff. For a moment, there's a terrifying silence, and then an unstoppable, accelerating momentum takes over. The initial $10 million was just seed money, a down payment on a dream. Production on the last frontier began, and I stepped out of my world of calculated certainties and into the chaotic, intoxicating universe of filmmaking. I wasn't just the financier. I made sure of that. I insisted on a hands-on producer credit. I wanted to be in the trenches. I traded my tailored suits for designer jeans and my boardroom for a canvas-backed director's chair with Leland Montgomery stenciled on it in bold white letters. That chair was my throne, and the film set was my new kingdom. The experience was everything my staid corporate life was not. It was a traveling circus of artists, technicians, and dreamers. One week we were in the stark, otherworldly landscapes of Iceland, simulating a desolate alien planet. The next, we were on a colossal soundstage in London, inside a spaceship cockpit so meticulously detailed that you felt you could actually pilot it through the cosmos. The sheer scale of the operation was breathtaking. Hundreds of people moved in a synchronized, frenetic dance, all orchestrated by Julian. And I was at the center of it, the benevolent king funding the entire spectacle. The crew, the actors, everyone treated me with a fawning reverence. They didn't see a real estate developer playing dress-up. They saw the man who made the impossible possible. My ego, already inflated by decades of business success, swelled to a monstrous size. Julian was a master at feeding that ego. He was no longer just a director. He was my creative partner, my guru. He would pull me aside, his eyes blazing with passion, to show me the daily rushes on a monitor. "Look, Leland, look at the poetry we are creating. This isn't just a scene, it's a painting in motion. Your vision is coming to life." My vision? I had no vision beyond what he had planted in my head, but I eagerly accepted the credit. I started to believe that I had some innate, untapped artistic sensibility. I began offering opinions on camera angles, on costume design, on the emotional nuance of a line of dialogue. And Julian, ever the savvy manipulator, would listen intently, nod and say, "Brilliant, Leland, absolutely brilliant. That's exactly the kind of insight this project needs." I was no longer just the money. I was the muse. The problem with a muse who has an infinite checkbook is that he becomes an enabler for a madman. The initial $10 million budget evaporated in the first 2 months. Julian's vision was a bottomless pit. He insisted on using a rare, discontinued film stock for a specific luminous quality, which required a global search and cost a fortune. He decided a 10-minute sequence needed to be shot in zero gravity, necessitating the rental of a parabolic flight aircraft at an astronomical daily rate. "We cannot compromise the art, Leland," he would declare, and I, swept up in the grandeur of it all, would agree. The budget climbed to 15 million, then 20. Each new expense was presented not as a problem, in the way my old business operated, but as a glorious necessity for the masterpiece we were crafting. The cracks, however, were not just appearing on my balance sheet. They were spiderwebbing through my life back home. During the rare weekends I would fly back, my family treated me like a stranger. Sarah, my wife, had watched my transformation with growing alarm. The man she had married, a pragmatic and grounded individual, had been replaced by this Hollywood caricature who spoke in grand pronouncements about art and legacy. One evening, she sat me down in our cavernous living room, the silence of the house a stark contrast to the constant noise of the film set. "Leland, I looked at our accounts," she said, her voice quiet but firm. $22 million on this movie. When is it going to stop? "It's an investment, Sarah," I replied, the words sounding hollow even to me. "This isn't just some frivolous expense. This is history. This is for us, for our family's name." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "For us? I barely see you. When you are here, you're not present. You're somewhere in outer space with that director of yours. You're obsessed. This isn't building a legacy. It's lighting a bonfire with our life's work." What happened to the man who believed in things he could touch? I didn't have a good answer. Her pragmatism felt like an attack on my newfound identity. Her concern felt like a lack of faith in my vision. The conversation escalated into the worst fight of our 30-year marriage. I accused her of being small-minded, of not understanding the scale of what I was trying to achieve. She accused me of having lost my mind to a cult of personality. I stormed out, flying back to the set the next morning, seeking refuge in the one place where I was still seen as a visionary, a king. I chose the adulation of strangers over the love of my family. I was so fixated on my celluloid dream that I failed to see the real-world masterpiece, my marriage, crumbling around me. Back on set, a new crisis was brewing. A seasoned, no-nonsense line producer named Marcus, whom the studio had insisted we hire to keep some semblance of fiscal sanity, confronted me. He came to my trailer with a binder full of spreadsheets and a grim expression. "Mr. Montgomery," he said, skipping the pleasantries, "we are in a death spiral. Julian's spending is out of control. We're 6 weeks behind schedule and already 10 million over budget. If we don't shut down production right now and reevaluate everything, this project will consume you whole." The old Leland would have listened. The old Leland would have studied the numbers, recognized the red flags, and taken decisive action. But the new Leland, the Hollywood mogul, heard Marcus's words as an insult, a challenge to my authority. He was the voice of doubt, the voice of reason, the very things I had flown halfway across the world to escape. Julian had already been poisoning me against Marcus for weeks, calling him a bean counter and a bureaucrat with no soul. "Marcus," I said, my voice dangerously calm, "your job is to facilitate the director's vision, not to obstruct it. If you can't handle the scale of this production, perhaps you're not the right man for the job." The color drained from his face. He simply closed his binder. "I understand," he said, his voice clipped. "You're signing the checks." He resigned an hour later. I saw it as a victory, a necessary pruning of negativity. In reality, I had just fired the only brake pedal on a runaway train. With Marcus gone, all financial oversight vanished. Julian now came directly to me for everything, and I, high on my own perceived genius, approved every request. We needed 100 more extras for a battle scene? Granted. He wanted to commission a world-renowned composer to write the score before a single frame was edited. Done. The budget soared past 30 million. And that's when David called. I hadn't spoken to him in months, not since our fateful meeting. His tone was funereal. "Leland, the banks are getting nervous. Your liquidity is dangerously low. You're over-leveraged. You need to stop this, now, before it's too late." It was the final straw. His sober warning felt like a betrayal. "You never believed in this project, David," I snarled into the phone. "You're fired. I'll have my lawyers send over the paperwork." I hung up before he could respond, my hand trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. I had severed the last tie to my old life, to the voice of caution. I was completely untethered, floating in Julian's orbit, convinced of our shared destiny. To cover the spiraling costs, I did the one thing I had sworn to my father I would never do. I began taking out massive loans, using my prime commercial properties, the very bedrock of my empire, as collateral. My buildings, my tangible, reliable, beautiful buildings, the ones that had predictable cash flows and solid foundations. I was trading brick and mortar for light and shadow. It's just a bridge loan, I rationalized to myself, sitting alone in a 5-star hotel suite on the other side of the world. It's temporary, just until the film is released and the profits start pouring in. This isn't debt, it's fuel for the rocket ship. But it wasn't a rocket ship. I was building a bridge straight into the abyss, and I was gleefully marching my entire life, my family, and my fortune across it. Firing David wasn't a clean break, it was an amputation. I had severed the part of my brain that processed logic and consequence. Now I was operating purely on ego and momentum, barreling down a path of my own making with Julian Croft as my co-pilot, whispering assurances that we were flying toward the sun, not crashing into it. The production of The Last Frontier entered its final, most gluttonous phase. We were no longer making a movie. We were engaged in an act of monumental self-indulgence, funded by the slow, systematic liquidation of my life's work. The total expenditure, once a horrifying number I tracked daily, had become an abstraction. 35 million, 40, 45. The figures lost all meaning. They were just entries in a ledger, the cost of birthing a masterpiece. The atmosphere on set had transformed. The initial creative excitement had curdled into a kind of weary decadence. We were so far over budget and behind schedule that a strange sense of fatalism took hold. Every day was a new crisis, a new fire to be extinguished with another dousing of cash. The lead actor, a temperamental star with an ego as fragile as spun glass, broke his ankle performing a stunt he'd insisted on doing himself. The doctors said he'd be out for 3 months. To any sane production, this would be a catastrophe, a moment to pause and regroup. To Julian, it was an opportunity. "The universe is providing us with a gift, Leland," he proclaimed, his eyes wild with a manic energy. "This allows us to perfect the visual effects. We can do the reshoots for the 3rd act that I've been dreaming of." He was talking about refilming the entire climax of the movie. He had decided, in a fit of late-night inspiration, that the original ending was too nihilistic. He now envisioned a more hopeful, transcendent conclusion, one that would require building entirely new sets, designing new costumes, and weeks of additional filming. It was a financially suicidal proposition. It would add at least another 5 million to the pyre. I should have put my foot down. I should have shut the entire production down and salvaged what little I could. But saying no would have meant admitting defeat. It would have meant that Marcus and David and Sarah had all been right. My pride wouldn't allow it. So I nodded. I authorized the expenditure. I chose to keep the fantasy alive, even as I could feel the foundations of my reality groaning under the strain. I was living in a bubble of my own creation. My phone, which once rang incessantly with calls from partners and brokers, fell silent. The business world I had once dominated had moved on without me. I was no longer Leland Montgomery, the real estate titan. I was that crazy guy sinking his fortune into a movie. I didn't care. The only voices I listened to were those within the bubble, Julian and his coterie of sycophants who depended on my largesse for their livelihoods. They were my court, and in daily meetings, they would tell me what a visionary I was, how brave I was for protecting Julian's singular artistic process from the crass demands of commerce. They assured me we weren't just making a film, we were creating an event that would be spoken of for generations. I drank their praise like a man dying of thirst. Finally, after nearly 2 years of chaotic, hemorrhage-inducing production, the film was in the can. The final cost was a staggering $50 million, every penny of which was mine, either directly or through loans secured against my assets. Now came the moment of vindication. The marketing machine roared to life. We cut a trailer, a bombastic 2-minute assault on the senses filled with stunning, context-free visuals and a thundering score. Julian and I watched the final cut in a private theatre, convinced it was a work of unparalleled genius. "They won't know what hit them," Julian whispered reverently as the screen went black. He was right, but not in the way he imagined. We released the trailer online, expecting a tidal wave of awe and anticipation. Instead, we got a tsunami of mockery. The comment sections and film forums were brutal. "Looks like a perfume commercial shot in space," one user wrote. "Pretentious and confusing," said another. "So this is what $50 million of hubris looks like." I was apoplectic. I scrolled through the comments for hours, my stomach churning. "They don't understand it," I fumed to the marketing team. "They're idiots. They can't appreciate true art." I refused to believe the trailer was the problem. The problem was the audience. In a panic, I authorized another $2 million for an emergency marketing blitz, a desperate attempt to force-feed our vision to an ungrateful public. The true moment of reckoning came a few weeks before the scheduled release. As is customary, we held a private screening for industry insiders and potential distributors. This was our chance to secure a wide theatrical release to get the major cinema chains on board. The theater was filled with the most powerful people in Hollywood: studio executives, seasoned producers, cynical critics. The lights dimmed. The film began. For 2.5 excruciating hours, I sat in the darkness, not watching the screen, but listening to the audience. I was listening for the gasps of wonder, the quiet weeping during the emotional climax, the murmurs of appreciation. But all I heard was silence. A dead, heavy, uncomfortable silence. There was no laughter at the witty lines, no tension during the suspenseful scenes. There was only the low hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rustle of someone shifting in their seat. When the credits finally rolled and the lights came up, there was a smattering of polite, half-hearted applause that died almost immediately. Nobody made eye contact with me. People filed out quickly, whispering to each other, avoiding me and Julian as if we were carriers of a plague. The dream was dying, right there in that silent, half-empty theater. My new publicist, a woman who specialized in damage control, was already in my ear, spinning the disaster. "It's an art film, Leland. It's challenging. The mainstream might not get it at first, but I knew better. I saw it in their faces. It wasn't that they didn't get it. It was that there was nothing to get. We hadn't made a complex masterpiece. We had made an incomprehensible, self-indulgent mess." As I stood there, paralyzed by a creeping dread, a veteran studio executive, a man named Silverstein, whom I had met at a few galas, walked over. He was an old-school shark, a man who had seen hundreds of films succeed and fail. He had a look on his face that wasn't triumphant, but pitiful. He gently placed a hand on my shoulder, guiding me away from the dispersing crowd. His voice was low, devoid of malice, which somehow made his words cut even deeper. "Leland," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper, "I'm going to give you some free advice because you seem like a decent guy who's in way over his head. Cancel the wide release. Don't spend another dime on marketing. Put it in a few theaters in New York and LA for a week to make it eligible for awards you'll never win, and then bury it." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The film is a catastrophe. It's unsalvageable. Pray you make back the cost of the posters on streaming rights 5 years from now." The hand on my shoulder felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. His words weren't an opinion, they were a verdict. An executioner's sentence delivered with a sympathetic smile. In that moment, the entire elaborate fantasy I had constructed around myself shattered into a million pieces. The adulation of the crew, the grand pronouncements from Julian, my own deluded belief in my artistic genius. It was all a lie. The deafening noise that had filled my world for the past 2 years wasn't the sound of a masterpiece being forged. It was the sound of my empire, my life's work, my entire world, beginning to crack apart at the seams, and I was standing directly on the fault line. If you followed me this far down the rabbit hole, you can probably smell the smoke from the wreckage. My journey from the heights of a real estate empire to the depths of this cinematic folly has been a masterclass in self-destruction. So, if you haven't subscribed yet, now would be the time, because the final implosion was nothing short of spectacular. And I need to ask you, looking back at this cascade of errors, what do you think was my single greatest mistake? Was it trusting a charismatic charlatan? Was it firing the only voice of reason in my ear? Or was it simply the blinding, all-consuming power of my own pride? Let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely curious to see the verdict from the outside. Silverstein's words were a death sentence, but my hubris was a terminal illness I wasn't ready to succumb to. I refused his advice. How could I bury the film? Burying the film meant burying $50 million. It meant burying 2 years of my life. Most importantly, it meant admitting to the world, to my family, and to myself that I had failed on a colossal, history-making scale. My pride, wounded and cornered, made one last fatal stand. I convinced myself that Silverstein and the other executives were dinosaurs, relics of an old system who couldn't recognize groundbreaking art. The public, I reasoned, the real people, they would understand it. They would vindicate me. Against all advice, I pushed forward with a wide theatrical release. I poured the last of my liquid reserves into television spots and online ads, doubling down on a hand that was already a guaranteed loser. Opening weekend arrived, the day of my vindication or my crucifixion. I couldn't bear to look at the industry tracking numbers, which were already predicting a cataclysm. Instead, I decided to see it for myself. I wanted to be there in the trenches, to feel the audience's reaction firsthand. I drove to a multiplex in the suburbs, a place where real families went to the movies. I bought a ticket. The irony was not lost on me, paying $12 to see my own $50 million disaster, and slipped into the back of a cavernous, mostly empty theater. There were maybe 15 other people scattered throughout the auditorium. The film started, my name flashing on the screen in enormous letters, produced by Leland Montgomery. In the darkness, it felt less like a credit and more like an epitaph. The 2.5 hours that followed were the most agonizing of my life. It was worse than the silent screening for the distributors. This was real. These were the people I had counted on to save me. A young couple in the front row got up and left 30 minutes in. A man a few rows ahead of me fell asleep, his snores occasionally cutting through the ponderous dialogue on screen. The worst part was the laughter, not the joyful laughter of entertainment, but the derisive, incredulous snorts during scenes that were meant to be profound and deeply moving. They were laughing at my dream. When the credits finally rolled, the handful of remaining patrons bolted for the exits as if escaping a burning building. I just sat there in the sticky, darkened theater, the silence broken only by the sound of a janitor starting to sweep up popcorn in the aisle. The emptiness of the room was a perfect mirror for the hollowness I felt inside. The box office numbers that came out on Monday were not just bad, they were historic. A public humiliation rendered in cold, hard figures. The Last Frontier was officially declared one of the biggest financial flops of the decade. The media, which had largely ignored the film's production, now descended like vultures. Trade publications ran scathing articles dissecting the film's epic failure, detailing its bloated budget and my naive involvement. My name was no longer a symbol of business acumen. It was a punchline, a cautionary tale for wealthy fools with Hollywood ambitions. That Monday was the day the dominoes began to fall in earnest. The first call was from the lead banker at the consortium that held the loans against my properties. His voice, once warm and obsequious, was now as cold and sharp as ice. There were no pleasantries. "Leland, we saw the weekend numbers. The collateral on your loans is now in jeopardy. We're calling in the notes. You have 90 days. 90 days. It sounded like a lifetime, but I knew it was a death knell. The value of my properties was tied to their income streams, but the debt I had piled on them was based on their peak market value. With the $50 million from the film completely gone, there was no longer any cash to service that mountain of debt. The engine had run out of fuel. The next few months were a blur of escalating panic and methodical dismantling. My life became a series of sterile meeting rooms with lawyers and accountants, men and women who spoke in the dispassionate language of bankruptcy and liquidation. The process was brutally efficient. First went the trophy assets, the office tower downtown, the luxury retail complex. Each sale was a public spectacle, another news story chronicling my downfall. The money from those sales didn't even touch my hands. It went straight to the banks, barely satisfying the ravenous appetite of the interest I owed. Then they came for the personal effects. The collection of classic cars, each one a memory of a successful deal, was carted away for auction. The art from our walls was taken down, leaving pale, ghostly rectangles where masterpieces used to hang. And then, the final, most devastating blow: the house. The home where Sarah and I had raised our daughter, the physical manifestation of our shared life, was put on the market. The day the for sale sign was hammered into our perfectly manicured lawn, Sarah finally broke. She didn't scream or cry. She just looked at me with an exhaustion so profound it seemed to age her a decade right before my eyes. "I can't do this anymore, Leland," she whispered. "I can't watch you burn down everything we ever built. I'm going to stay with my sister." She packed a single suitcase and left. The silence she left behind was more deafening than any argument we ever had. I thought I had hit rock bottom. I was wrong. The final betrayal was yet to come. Amid the chaos, I tried to reach Julian Croft, the co-architect of this ruin. His phone went straight to voicemail. His agent claimed he was on a spiritual retreat and unreachable. A week later, I saw his face plastered on the cover of a prominent film magazine. The headline read, "Julian Croft, How My Vision Was Compromised." In the interview, he masterfully painted himself as a victim, a pure artist whose brilliant work was sabotaged by the constant, clumsy interference of a novice producer with more money than sense. He blamed me for everything, for the budget overruns, for the nonsensical plot, for the film's catastrophic failure. He threw me under the bus and then reversed over me to make sure the job was done. The end came not with a bang, but with a brown envelope slipped under the door of the small furnished apartment I was renting. It was an eviction notice. The liquidation of my assets hadn't even been enough to cover all the debt. I was beyond broke. I was in a hole so deep I couldn't even see the light. I sat on a lumpy sofa that smelled of other people's lives, holding the eviction notice in one hand. On the coffee table in front of me was the only thing I had managed to keep from the wreckage: a single glossy poster for The Last Frontier. I stared at the heroic face of the lead actor, at the epic spacescape behind him, at my name printed at the bottom. In the span of a few years, I had gone from a penthouse overlooking the city to a basement apartment with a view of a brick wall. It was ironic, really. I was back with the bricks. Only this time I didn't own a single one of them. They owned me. Being at the absolute bottom has a strange kind of clarity. When you have nothing left to lose, you also have nothing left to hide behind. The eviction notice was the final punctuation mark on the long, disastrous sentence of my fall from grace. The shame was a physical presence, a heavy cloak I couldn't take off. For weeks, I drifted in a fog of depression and self-pity. I was a ghost haunting the ruins of my own life, invisible to the world that had once celebrated me. My name, once a synonym for success, was now a verb for failure. To pull a Montgomery became industry shorthand for catastrophic, ego-driven financial ruin. The humiliation was absolute. The first glimmer of light in that profound darkness came from the most unexpected of places. It was a phone call from David, the man I had unceremoniously fired, the Cassandra, whose prophecies I had ignored. I almost didn't answer, expecting an "I told you so" wrapped in a sheath of legal threats. Instead, what I heard was simple human decency. "Leland," he said, his voice devoid of any triumph, "I read about the apartment. I have a small guest cottage behind my house. It's not much, but it's empty. The key is under the mat." He hung up before I could even formulate a response. Pride is a luxury the destitute cannot afford. That afternoon, I packed my few remaining possessions into 2 cardboard boxes and made the most humbling journey of my life. Living in that cottage, I was forced to confront the man I had become. The silence was deafening. There were no assistants to manage my schedule, no ringing phones, no adoring film crews. There was just me and the wreckage. David was a quiet landlord. He would occasionally leave a bag of groceries on my doorstep, a silent act of grace that felt both incredibly kind and deeply humiliating. He never once said, "I warned you." He didn't have to. His quiet, stable, unassuming life was a constant, unspoken rebuke to the glittering chaos I had chased. To survive, I had to work. My name was too toxic for the corporate world, so I took what I could get. I became a handyman, leveraging the skills I'd learned as a young man renovating that first little house. I fixed leaky faucets, patched drywall, and repaired broken fences for people who had no idea their handyman was once a near billionaire. The work was hard, the pay was meager, but something unexpected began to happen. At the end of a long day of physical labor, my hands aching and my body tired, my mind was quiet. The ghosts of my failure were silenced, if only for a few hours, by the simple, satisfying finality of a job well done. I was building things again, small things, tangible things. I was fixing what was broken. It was a slow, painful, but necessary penance. It was during this time that I had my epiphany. It didn't come in a flash of lightning, but in a slow dawn of understanding. My greatest mistake wasn't the movie. The movie was just the symptom of a much deeper disease. My mistake was believing that my worth was measured by the scale of my accomplishments. I had built a real estate empire, but it wasn't enough. I needed to conquer Hollywood. I had traded a fortune I possessed for a legacy I coveted. I hadn't been investing in art. I had been investing in a desperate attempt to fill a void within myself, a gaping insecurity that no amount of money or fame could ever patch. I was trying to buy a feeling of importance that I mistakenly believed I lacked. The real failure wasn't financial. It was spiritual. One day my daughter Emily came to visit me at the cottage. She was the one person who had tried to stay in touch, but whom I had pushed away in my shame. She didn't look at my reduced circumstances with pity. She brought a thermos of coffee and sat with me on the small porch. We didn't talk about the money or the movie. We talked about her life, her job, her plans. For the first time in years, I was just listening. I wasn't waiting for my turn to talk, to offer advice from my lofty perch, to somehow turn the conversation back to my own grand narrative. I was just her father, present and accounted for. As she was leaving, she hugged me and said, "It's good to have you back, Dad." It was in that simple sentence that I finally understood. The real empire I had neglected was my family. The true legacy I had squandered was their love and respect. Slowly, I began to rebuild, not my fortune, but myself. I started a small woodworking business out of a rented garage. It was a hobby I'd always loved, but never had time for. The scent of sawdust, of cedar and pine replaced the sterile smell of boardrooms and the artificial sense of movie sets. I crafted custom furniture, simple, honest, well-made pieces. My hands, once accustomed to signing multi-million-dollar contracts, found a new purpose in the grain of a piece of oak. My business didn't make me rich, but it paid my bills and, more importantly, it gave me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in decades. I eventually reached out to Sarah, not to reconcile, but to apologize. I met her for coffee, and for the first time, I took complete and total ownership of my failures. I didn't make excuses. I didn't blame Julian. I explained that my arrogance and my ego had destroyed what we had built together, and for that, I was profoundly sorry. She listened, and I could see the decades of resentment in her eyes begin to soften. We would never get back together. The damage was too deep for that. But we found a new kind of relationship, built on a foundation of forgiveness and a shared history. We found peace, so that's my story. I lost over $50 million trying to etch my name onto the stars, but I only found myself when I came crashing back down to earth. I learned that money is an amplifier. It doesn't make you good or bad. It just makes you more of what you already are. If you are insecure, it will make you arrogant. If you are greedy, it will make you rapacious. If you are generous, it will make you a philanthropist. My wealth amplified my deep-seated need for validation, and it almost destroyed me. The true measure of a man isn't what he builds for the world to see, but the strength of the foundation he has within himself. Pride builds skyscrapers of glass that can shatter in an instant. Humility builds a foundation of stone that can withstand any storm. This is my life now. The smell of wood, the satisfaction of a solid joint, the quiet evenings, the simple phone calls with my daughter. I don't have an empire anymore. I don't have a legacy that will be written about in magazines. But I have my self-respect. I have peace. And in the end, I've come to realize that is the only kind of wealth that truly matters. If this story has resonated with you in any way, please share this video with someone who might need to hear this message. And finally, I want to learn from you. What is the greatest lesson that money, or the lack of it, has ever taught you? Leave your answer in the comments below. I'll be reading every single one. Thank you for listening.